Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Assyrian conquests, 911-600, and 9 BCE. Now buckle up as we begin. In the heart of northern Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris River, lay the ancient city of Ashur, cradle of what would become history's most ruthless empire. By 1000 BCE, Assyria had endured centuries of weakness, its borders shrinking under pressure from Aramean tribes and rival kingdoms. The once mighty realm of Tiglath-Pileser I seemed destined for obscurity until fate delivered a warrior king who would ignite 3 centuries of conquest. Adad-nirari II ascended the throne in 911 BCE, inheriting a kingdom barely controlling its traditional heartland. Yet within this seemingly diminished realm burned the embers of imperial ambition, waiting for the right moment to burst into the flames of conquest that would consume the ancient Near East. Adad-nirari II understood that Assyria's survival demanded aggressive expansion. His military reforms revolutionized ancient warfare, introducing iron weapons on a massive scale and creating the world's first truly professional army. Unlike the seasonal militias of neighboring kingdoms, Assyrian soldiers served year-round, their loyalty bound to the king through regular pay and generous spoils of war. The king's engineers perfected siege warfare, developing battering rams, mobile towers, and tunneling techniques that made previously impregnable cities vulnerable. Most crucially, Adad-nirari instituted a policy of calculated terror designed to break enemy morale before battles began. Cities that surrendered received mercy and incorporation into the growing empire, while those that resisted faced systematic destruction and population deportation. Between 911 and 891 BCE, his campaigns restored Assyrian control over the upper Tigris Valley, conquered Aramean settlements, and pushed the borders south toward Babylon. These early victories established the template for 3 centuries of expansion that would transform Assyria from a regional power into the ancient world's dominant empire. Tukulti-Ninurta II and his successor Ashurbanipal II continued the aggressive expansion. But it was under Shalmaneser III that Assyrian ambitions truly soared beyond Mesopotamia. Ascending the throne in 858 BCE, Shalmaneser III launched campaigns that would span 35 years and extend Assyrian influence from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. His war machine rolled westward into Syria, where it encountered the powerful kingdom of Damascus and the rising threat of Israel under King Ahab. The Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE marked Assyria's first major confrontation with a coalition of Western kingdoms, including Israel, Damascus, and Hamath. Though Shalmaneser claimed victory, the fierce resistance demonstrated that Western expansion would require sustained effort and overwhelming force. The king's famous black obelisk, discovered at Nimrud, depicts tributaries from across the known world, bringing exotic gifts including elephants, camels, and precious metals. Among the tribute bearers carved in stone stands Jehu, king of Israel, prostrating himself before Assyrian might. These Western campaigns established Assyria as the dominant power in the Levant and opened the wealthy trade routes that would fuel further expansion. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, beginning in 744 BCE, marked the transformation of Assyrian conquests from raids for tribute into systematic imperial administration. This military genius revolutionized warfare through the creation of specialized units, including heavy cavalry, siege specialists, and engineering corps capable of crossing rivers and scaling mountains. His administrative reforms divided conquered territories into provinces ruled by Assyrian governors, ensuring direct control rather than unreliable tributary relationships. The policy of mass deportation reached industrial scale under his rule, with entire populations forcibly relocated to prevent rebellion and provide labor for imperial projects. His Western campaigns systematically dismantled the remaining independent kingdoms of Syria and Palestine. Damascus fell in 732 BCE after a brutal 3-year siege, its population scattered across the empire. the northern kingdom of Israel suffered devastating losses, with thousands deported to Assyria and replaced by colonists from other conquered territories. Babylon, weakened by internal strife, submitted to Assyrian overlordship as Tiglath-Pileser claimed the ancient title of King of Babylon. By his death in 727 BCE, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, transforming from a Mesopotamian kingdom into a true world empire. Sargon II's ascension in 722 BCE ushered in an era of unprecedented military innovation and territorial expansion that would push Assyrian borders to their greatest extent. His reign began with the completion of Israel's destruction, as the siege of Samaria finally succeeded after 3 years of desperate resistance. 27,000 Israelites were deported deep into the Assyrian heartland, while foreign colonists replaced them in a systematic ethnic engineering project. But Sargon's greatest achievements lay in his northern and eastern campaigns against the kingdom of Urartu and the emerging threat of Sumerian raiders. His military engineers perfected mountain warfare techniques, allowing Assyrian armies to operate effectively in the rugged terrain of Armenia and Iran. The capture of the Urartian fortress of Musasir in 714 BCE broke the back of Assyria's most persistent northern rival, securing the empire's flank for further expansion. Sargon's western campaigns extended Assyrian control into central Anatolia, where local kingdoms submitted rather than face the empire's devastating siege warfare. His new capital at Dur-Sharukin, constructed with tribute and labor from across the known world, stood as a monument to imperial achievement and the wealth flowing from systematic conquest. The succession of Sennacherib in 705 BCE brought to the throne perhaps history's most systematic destroyer of cities, whose campaigns would terrorize the ancient world and establish Assyrian psychological warfare as an art form. His siege of Babylon in 700 and Thremonus 702 BCE demonstrated the empire's willingness to destroy even the most sacred cities when faced with rebellion. The ancient metropolis, source of Mesopotamian culture and learning, was systematically demolished, its temples razed, and its population scattered. But Sennacherib's most famous campaign targeted the kingdom of Judah and its defiant king Hezekiah. The Assyrian war machine rolled through Palestine in 701 BCE, reducing 46 fortified cities to rubble before arriving at Jerusalem's gates. The siege of Lachish, immortalized in Sennacherib's palace reliefs, showcased Assyrian siege craft at its most terrifying. Massive siege ramps, mobile towers, and coordinated assault teams overwhelmed defenders, while Assyrian artists recorded every detail of the city's destruction. Jerusalem's miraculous survival, attributed by Hebrew sources to divine intervention, remained one of the few setbacks in Sennacherib's otherwise unstoppable campaigns. His reconstruction of Nineveh into the ancient world's largest city symbolized Assyrian power at its zenith. Esarhaddon's reign from 681 to 669 BCE marked Assyria's greatest territorial triumph with the conquest of Egypt, the ancient world's other great power. His military genius lay in solving the logistical nightmare of campaigning across the Sinai Desert, traditionally considered impassable for large armies. Assyrian engineers constructed a supply network using Arabian camels and Phoenician naval support, enabling the empire's war machine to reach the Nile Delta. The first invasion in 673 BCE failed against fierce Egyptian resistance, but Esarhaddon learned from defeat and returned with overwhelming force. His second campaign in 671 BCE shattered Egyptian defenses at the Battle of Ishapri, opening the road to Memphis. The ancient pharaonic capital fell after a brief siege, and Taharqa, the Nubian pharaoh of Egypt's 25th dynasty, fled south to Thebes. Esarhaddon's triumph was complete. Assyria now controlled the civilized world from the Persian Gulf to the cataracts of the Nile. Egyptian princes, Phoenician merchants, and Arabian chieftains brought tribute to Nineveh, acknowledging Assyrian supremacy. The empire's administrative system groaned under the weight of governing territories, spanning 3,000 miles, requiring unprecedented bureaucratic innovation to maintain control over history's largest ancient empire. Ashurbanipal's accession in 668 BCE brought to power the last great Assyrian conqueror, whose reign would witness both the empire's cultural zenith and the beginning of its fatal overextension. His early campaigns focused on securing Egypt, where rebellions constantly threatened Assyrian control. The invasion of 667 BCE culminated in the sack of Thebes, ancient Egypt's religious capital and repository of 3 millennia of accumulated wealth. No foreign army had ever penetrated so far up the Nile, and the systematic looting of Thebes sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Ashurbanipal's soldiers stripped gold from temple walls, carried away centuries of accumulated tribute, and deported craftsmen to Assyria. Yet even as his armies achieved unprecedented victories, cracks appeared in the imperial foundation. The Babylonian rebellion of his brother Shamash-Shumukin in 652 BCE forced Ashurbanipal to conduct a brutal 4-year siege of Babylon, devastating the empire's second city. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on distant frontiers. Assyrian raiders swept down from the steppes, and Sumerian tribes pressed against northern borders. The king's famous library at Nineveh, containing thousands of cuneiform tablets preserving Mesopotamian learning, represented the empire's cultural achievements, even as military challenges multiplied beyond the capacity of imperial resources to address. The Elamite Wars of Ashurbanipal's middle reign demonstrated both Assyrian military capabilities and the growing strain of maintaining empire through constant warfare. Elam, located in modern-day Iran, had supported Babylonian rebellions and harbored Assyrian enemies for decades. In 646 BCE, Ashurbanipal launched a campaign of systematic destruction intended to eliminate Elam as a regional power forever. His armies devastated the Elamite countryside, destroyed irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia, and reduced ancient cities like Susa to ruins. The Assyrian king boasted of scattering salt over Elamite fields and carrying away the bones of dead Elamite kings from their tombs. This campaign of cultural annihilation succeeded in destroying Elamite power, but also revealed the empire's increasing reliance on terroristic methods to maintain control. The resources required for such total warfare stretched Assyrian capabilities to their limits, while breeding hatred that would eventually fuel imperial collapse. Meanwhile, new threats emerged on multiple frontiers simultaneously. Median tribes unified under strong leadership in the Iranian highlands, while Chaldean princes consolidated power in southern Babylon. The Psamtik dynasty established Egyptian independence, and Lydian expansion in western Anatolia challenged Assyrian influence in that vital region. The death of Ashurbanipal around 627 BCE marked the beginning of Assyria's rapid decline, as succession disputes paralyzed the imperial government at the moment when external threats reached critical mass. His sons Ashur-etil-ilani and Sin-shar-ishkun fought a devastating civil war that consumed resources and attention, while enemies gathered on every frontier. The Babylonian governor Nabopolassar declared independence in 626 BCE, establishing the Neo-Babylonian dynasty that would become Assyria's executioner. His revolt succeeded because Assyrian forces were scattered across an empire grown too large to defend effectively. Simultaneously, the Median kingdom under Cyaxares emerged as a major power in Iran, unifying the scattered tribes that had long provided Assyria with mercenaries and tribute. The Scythian invasions disrupted the empire's northern provinces, while Egyptian independence eliminated a crucial source of wealth and manpower. Most critically, the empire's Aramean and Chaldean subjects, brutalized by centuries of Assyrian rule, eagerly supported any power that promised liberation from the imperial yoke. The administrative system that had once efficiently extracted tribute and resources from subject peoples now faced coordinated resistance across multiple theaters simultaneously. Assyrian military superiority, based on technological advantages and professional organization, eroded as enemies adopted similar weapons and tactics while maintaining numerical superiority. The Babylonian-Median alliance, forged in 614 BCE, created an unstoppable coalition that would systematically dismember the Assyrian Empire over the next 5 years. Nabopolassar of Babylon and Cyaxares of Media divided their strategic objectives, with Babylonian forces controlling southern Mesopotamia, while Median armies swept down from the Zagros Mountains to threaten the empire's heartland. Their first major success came with the capture of Ashur in 614 BCE, the ancient religious capital where Assyrian kings had worshipped for over 1,000 years. The city's fall was more than a military defeat. It represented the breaking of divine protection that had supposedly guaranteed Assyrian dominance. Median soldiers razed the great temple of Ashur-God, scattering the priests who had consecrated imperial campaigns for centuries. The psychological impact reverberated throughout the empire as subject peoples interpreted Ashur's destruction as proof that the gods had abandoned their oppressors. Assyrian provincial armies began defecting to the allies, while others simply dissolved as soldiers deserted to protect their families. The empire's Aramean subjects rose in coordinated rebellion, cutting communications between remaining Assyrian strongholds and eliminating the local knowledge that had made imperial administration possible. Within 2 years, effective Assyrian control had collapsed everywhere except the immediate vicinity of Nineveh and a few isolated garrison towns. The siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE represented the culmination of centuries of imperial brutality as the victims of Assyrian conquest finally achieved their revenge. The great city that had terrorized the ancient world for 300 years found itself surrounded by a coalition army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Babylonian siege engineers, trained in techniques originally developed by their Assyrian oppressors, constructed massive earthworks and siege machines designed specifically to overcome Nineveh's legendary fortifications. The city's triple walls, reinforced by generations of paranoid kings, had never been breached by foreign enemies. Yet the allies possessed something previous attackers had lacked: intimate knowledge of Assyrian methods and unlimited motivation for revenge. The siege lasted 3 months as defenders desperately manned walls that stretched for miles around the sprawling metropolis. Sin-Shar-ishkun, the last great Assyrian king, personally led sorties against enemy siege works, fighting with the courage of desperation. But the empire's subject peoples had suffered too much and too long to show mercy. When the walls finally fell, probably due to flooding that undermined their foundations, the subsequent sack became legendary for its thoroughness. No major Assyrian city had ever fallen to foreign conquest, making Nineveh's destruction a watershed moment in ancient history. The fall of Nineveh unleashed a frenzy of destruction that shocked even the ancient world's jaded observers. The great palaces where Assyrian kings had displayed tribute from across the known world became infernos, as allied soldiers systematically looted 3 centuries of accumulated wealth. The famous library of Ashurbanipal, containing humanity's greatest collection of ancient learning, burned as soldiers sought gold and silver among the clay tablets. Assyrian nobles who had terrorized subject peoples for generations were dragged from hiding places and executed in the streets where they had once paraded foreign captives. The royal palace, scene of countless diplomatic receptions where kings had prostrated themselves before Assyrian power, became a slaughterhouse as the last defenders made their final stand. Sin-Shar-ishkun died in the flames of his own palace, choosing royal immolation over capture and disgrace. The systematic destruction continued for weeks as allied forces demolished monuments, melted down metal artwork, and scattered the stones of buildings that had symbolized imperial might. Persian and Median soldiers competed with Babylonians and Arameans in erasing every trace of the hated empire. When the destruction finally ended, the greatest city in the ancient world had been reduced to smoking ruins that would remain uninhabited for centuries. The destruction of Nineveh did not immediately end Assyrian resistance, as remnants of the imperial army rallied around Ashurbanipal, who established a final capital at Harran in northwestern Mesopotamia. This ancient city, sacred to the moon god Sin and strategically located on trade routes to Syria, became the last refuge of Assyrian independence. For 4 years, from 612 to 608 BCE, this rump state maintained tenuous existence while desperately seeking foreign support against the Babylonian-Median coalition. The surviving Assyrian forces retained their professional discipline and fighting skill, making them formidable opponents despite overwhelming odds. Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, alarmed by rising Babylonian power, dispatched an army northward to support the Assyrian remnant and maintain the regional balance of power. This unlikely alliance between ancient enemies reflected the complex diplomatic calculations of the late 7th century BCE. However, the intervention came too late to save Assyrian independence. Babylonian and Median forces systematically conquered the remaining Assyrian strongholds while preventing effective coordination between Egyptian and Assyrian armies. The brief Egyptian-Assyrian cooperation could not overcome the fundamental reality that the empire's subject peoples would never again accept Assyrian rule, regardless of external military support. The final siege of Harran in 608 BCE marked the definitive end of Assyrian independence as Babylonian forces under Nabopolassar completed the systematic destruction of the once mighty empire. The ancient city's walls, though formidable, could not withstand the concentrated assault of siege engines operated by engineers who had learned their craft from Assyrian masters. The Moon Temple of Sin, Harran's most sacred shrine, offered no divine protection as Babylonian soldiers scaled the walls and poured into the city's narrow streets. Ashurbanipal II died fighting in the final assault, ending the royal line that had claimed descent from gods and ruled the known world for centuries. His death meant that no legitimate claimant to the Assyrian throne survived to rally future resistance movements. The Egyptian relief force arrived too late to affect the outcome, finding only smoking ruins where the last Assyrian city had stood. Babylonian troops had methodically demolished Harran's fortifications and scattered its population, ensuring that no future Assyrian revival could use the strategic location as a base. The fall of Harran represented more than military defeat. It marked the complete extinction of Assyrian political independence and the end of 3 centuries of imperial expansion that had shaped the ancient Near East. The attempted Assyrian restoration of 607 BCE represented the empire's death rattle as Ashurbanipal II, supported by Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Necho II, made one final desperate bid to reclaim Harran and revive Assyrian independence. This last campaign demonstrated both the persistent fighting spirit of Assyrian military tradition and the impossibility of reversing 3 centuries of imperial brutality through external intervention. The Egyptian-Assyrian army that marched on Harran was formidable, combining Egyptian wealth and numbers with surviving Assyrian military expertise. However, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed since Nineveh's fall. Babylonian control over Mesopotamia was now consolidated, while Median power in Iran provided a secure eastern anchor for the anti-Assyrian coalition. Most critically, the empire's former subjects viewed any Assyrian restoration as an existential threat requiring desperate resistance. The siege of Harran lasted several months as Babylonian defenders, reinforced by local populations that remembered Assyrian oppression, fought with fanatical determination. When the assault finally failed and Ashurbanipal's forces withdrew towards Syria, the last hope for Assyrian political revival died with them. The failed restoration attempt marked the final chapter in a story that had begun with Adad-nirari II's conquests 3 centuries earlier. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE delivered the coup de grace to any remaining hopes for Assyrian revival, as Nebuchadnezzar II's Babylonian army crushed the combined Egyptian-Assyrian forces in one of antiquity's most decisive encounters. This battle represented far more than a tactical engagement. It determined which power would inherit the Assyrian Empire's former territories and assume dominance over the ancient Near East. The strategic city of Carchemish, controlling the crucial Euphrates crossing between Mesopotamia and Syria, had witnessed countless battles throughout history, but none with such far-reaching consequences. Nebuchadnezzar's victory was complete and devastating. The Egyptian army under Necho II suffered catastrophic losses, ending Egyptian aspirations to control Syria-Palestine for centuries. More significantly for our story, the last organized Assyrian military forces were annihilated in the battle's aftermath, eliminating any possibility of future restoration attempts. The battlefield at Carchemish became a graveyard for the remnants of 3 centuries of Assyrian military tradition. Professional soldiers whose fathers and grandfathers had terrorized the ancient world died, defending a cause that had already been lost at Nineveh 7 years earlier. With their destruction, the last institutional memory of Assyrian imperial administration and warfare vanished from history. The systematic destruction of Assyrian identity continued long after the empire's military defeat, as Babylonian and Persian conquerors implemented policies designed to prevent any future revival of their most dangerous predecessor. The Babylonians, who had suffered centuries of Assyrian oppression, proved particularly thorough in erasing institutional memory of imperial administration. Assyrian noble families that had administered the empire for generations were scattered across the ancient world, their lands redistributed to loyal Babylonian settlers. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE brought no relief for Assyrian aspirations, as Cyrus the Great maintained policies that kept former imperial territories fragmented under multiple satrapies. The great cities that had served as provincial capitals under Assyrian rule, Damascus, Tyre, Samaria, Memphis, were integrated into new administrative systems that bore no trace of their former imperial connections. Archaeological evidence suggests that many sites associated with Assyrian power were deliberately abandoned or had their monuments systematically defaced. The cultural genocide was so complete that within a century of Nineveh's fall, travelers reported that local populations could not identify the ruins of buildings that had once housed the ancient world's most powerful government. Even the Assyrian language gradually disappeared from official use as Aramaic became the lingua franca of the former empire. The discovery and excavation of Assyrian sites in the 19th century revealed the stunning scope of the empire's achievements and the totality of its historical erasure. British and French archaeologists working at Nineveh, Khorsabad, and Nimrud uncovered palace after palace filled with reliefs depicting centuries of conquest and tribute collection. The royal libraries yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets preserving literature, law codes, and administrative records that documented the ancient world's most sophisticated governmental system. These archaeological revelations transformed scholarly understanding of ancient Near Eastern history and demonstrated how completely the Assyrian Empire had vanished from historical memory. Local Arab populations had preserved no traditions connecting the mysterious ruins with the biblical Assyrians who had destroyed Israel and besieged Jerusalem. Even more remarkable was the discovery that Assyrian military and administrative innovations had influenced every subsequent empire from Persia to Rome. Yet this cultural transmission had occurred without conscious acknowledgement of its Assyrian origins. The empire's legacy lived on in the governmental structures, siege techniques, and diplomatic practices that became standard throughout the ancient world. Modern archaeological research continues to reveal the sophisticated infrastructure, roads, communication networks, and economic systems that enabled Assyrian control over territories spanning 3,000 miles of diverse terrain and cultures. The story of the Assyrian conquests from 911 to 609 BCE remains one of history's most remarkable examples of imperial rise and fall, demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of power based purely on military superiority. For 3 centuries, Assyrian armies dominated the ancient world through technological innovation, administrative efficiency, and psychological warfare that terrorized enemies into submission. Their empire stretched from Egypt to Iran, incorporating dozens of kingdoms and millions of subjects under a governmental system that would influence political organization for millennia to come. Yet the very brutality that enabled rapid conquest ultimately guaranteed imperial destruction, as subject peoples united in desperate resistance against their oppressors. The Assyrian example illustrates the fundamental tension between the requirements of expansion and the necessities of stable rule. Their military machine proved unstoppable in conquest, but generated such hatred that permanent control required constant warfare exceeding even Assyrian capabilities. When that military superiority finally faltered, the accumulated resentment of 3 centuries exploded in an orgy of destruction that erased Assyrian civilization from historical memory until modern archaeology restored their story to human knowledge. The rise and fall of this first true world empire offers timeless lessons about the relationship between power, brutality, and political survival. If you like today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.